Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Talking Acquisition. This is the weekly high-energy, informative, and slightly opinionated view on all things acquisition, procurement, and government contracting related. This is the place where the contracting and acquisition communities and our industry partners connect to talk, listen, and learn from each other. My name is William Randolph, and I am your host, and I'd like to introduce my co-host, my colleague, my partner, and my dear friend, Soraya Carrera. Hello, Soraya. How you doing?
Hello, Will. How are you?
I'm amazing, amazing. Back at it again.
All right. Well, let me share our disclaimer and then introduce our very special guest and our topic for this podcast. So our podcast shares information and views on a variety of topics that impact the federal acquisition community. Our goal is to provide thought leadership and perspective, not to criticize, judge, or render political opinions, although every now and then a few slip out. We provide this free service because we are former federal acquisition professionals and leaders. We believe that the creativity, innovation, and effectiveness of our community is unleashed when we share knowledge, information, and learning. We hope you enjoy our podcast, and we welcome the views and comments of our colleagues across the private and public sectors. And now I want to introduce our guest. We have a guest speaker today, Clay Goldwein, from CGI. Clay, I'm sorry, I'm like tongue twisted today, so I'm going to apologize in advance. But Clay and I kind of go way back. We've known each other for a while, but Clay leads the National Security and Justice Business Unit at CGI Federal, which is a wholly owned U.S. operating subsidiary of CGI Incorporated. As the business unit leader and senior vice president, Clay leads the development and execution of the business and solution strategy for a diverse client portfolio within national security and justice agencies. Throughout his career, Clay has been a leader in IT modernization, cloud, and cybersecurity. He joined CGI in 2004 through the merger with American Management Systems, where he actually began his career in 1994. He is recognized for his technical and management leadership, both internal to the company and externally. His work spans a wide range of federal, state, and commercial customers across a breadth of domains and technical areas. Clay is a fellow of the American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Council Partners Program. He also chairs the DHS group for the 4x24 Leadership Program and is an active participant in the Washington Executive National Security Council and the Professional Services Council. Clay, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, Soraya, and thank you, Will. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to tell our audience a little bit about, and tell Will probably, because he probably doesn't even remember, how kind of we came about to having you on the show. You and I were having an intellectual discussion, mostly on your part, because it was intellectual, about experience and past performance and how the government evaluates it and what we look for in experience and past performance. And I thought it'd be a good idea to have someone like you with your experience and background talk to us about experience and past performance, because this is a topic that's always been kind of near and dear to my heart. One that I've challenged some of my fellow CIOs out there on before when they've required federal experience when we talk about emerging technologies. So I'm going to open the floor up to you and let you kind of lead us off on the topic if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Soraya. So this is definitely a topic of interest for me, and I recall the conversation a little bit differently. I think the intellectual part was coming from the other side, but definitely a topic of interest nonetheless. And I think what's interesting about this is that the government is not always a technology leader. Oftentimes it's not the technology leader. And so when the government starts to look for past performance in a technology, by definition, if that particular past performance has been along for enough time for it to have been implemented, for there to be a CPAR or some sort of evaluation of the contractor, that technology is at least a year or two old, and possibly much older, depending upon how long it took the government to adopt it. And so it's often the case that if you want to access information about new technology, you have to be able to look beyond the walls of the federal government.
Yeah, 100% agreed. In fact, that's kind of the discussion that I've had multiple times with lots of our CIOs, that if you're really looking for the newest technologies and the newest approaches, if you're really looking for innovation, you have to lay off the federal experience. You have to go out there and really seek out companies and organizations that perhaps have done this in the industry environment. And then that starts to get a little shaky because it's kind of hard to get references when you're talking on the industry side, as you know, Will and I both know, having had to help people guide through that process.
Yeah.
I personally, I mean, I have an opinion about past performance, and I'll share that a little bit later. I'm going to turn it over to you, Will, and let you talk, because you know I have opinions.
Of course you do, and I've got one too. But so Clay, this is a question about the framing. We often frame it in terms of relevancy and recency, from how we frame past performance. In your opinion, if the government wanted to do this more effectively, what would relevancy and recency look like when you're going into the commercial space and trying to identify opportunities for past performance utilization? What would that look like in your opinion?
So I guess let's look at relevancy first. In terms of relevancy, I think there are ways to kind of split the baby, if you will. There are opportunities to say, we want relevant past performance in the federal market to show that you know how to work with a federal government agency, or this particular federal government agency even, but at the same time to also get relevant past performance with a technology that might be new, with a capability that might be different, with something that maybe only happens once in the entire federal government, but happens in other places outside the federal government, where you can make that tie and say, this is very relevant to what the federal government's trying to achieve. And then in a separate past performance, this is also relevant, and it shows the contractor's ability to work in the environment that they're going to need to be able to work in. So that's how I view relevancy. Is it's maybe a combination to get to the total that the government's trying to achieve.
Yeah, that makes total sense from the standpoint of, give me something that's relevant in the space for government work, but recent in the technology, if you will. So I love that. I love that combo platter. That just makes a lot of sense. What have you been successful, or where have you been successful in encouraging government organizations, agencies, contracting teams, acquisition teams to be able to, or be willing to be convinced? What is the strategy? How have you used that strategy before, and how do you convince them to be willing to be convinced that the baby split is a viable strategy?
So it's tricky, and I can't always predict where we're going to be successful and where we're not. Sometimes you try something out and you say, I don't know if this is going to work, and it does. And other times you try it out and you expect it's going to work and it falls flat. So there's some amount of variability there. But in general, I would say that the relevancy of the past performance is very much a factor in the government accepting that past performance, if the government even gets into a conversation about that. Sometimes sometimes you don't have the opportunity to get into the conversation about what that particular past performance is. The contracting officer is setting a standard, and that's going to be the standard for that particular procurement or for a set of procurements that they're working with. Sometimes you've had the opportunity, the program office, or you have a conversation with the program office, and they understand a little bit about some of the other performance that you may have. Sometimes you don't. So it's a little bit of a guessing game as to where it's going to ultimately be allowed and where it's not going to be allowed. And that makes it a little bit difficult to determine, hey, for this particular opportunity that we're looking at, what are our chances? Is it worth making that investment in pursuing this opportunity if we don't know whether or not the government is going to accept one of the past performance citations that we really feel is a best fit?
Is a best fit, yeah. So just a couple of thoughts on past performance, because I've grappled with this for a long time. First of all, I think when you're relying on past performance solely coming out of CPARS, good luck with that, because we know that CPARS is not complete, and the information presented is not always the best, right? We know that sometimes people just check off satisfactory just to be done with it because they don't want to have to write written comments. And so I think when you're going to do a past performance reference check, you got to pick up the phone and call. It's the same thing as when you're doing a reference check on personnel. If you're just going to rely on a little check mark system, good luck with that. But if you talk to somebody, you'll start to get, real information. But past performance is not a guarantee of great performance in the future, as I've always said. It's about probability of success, because the reality is, unless you have all circumstances being equal, you can't guarantee that past performance information guarantees good future performance or even great future performance. But what it does do is give you a level of certainty, a level of confidence that you're taking less risk. That said, it is about risk. And when you're trying to do something with new technologies, I think we have to change our thinking in government, right? If we want innovation and we want new technologies and we want to bring about change, then we have to be willing to take a certain level of risk and say, I'm going to look at the company's past performance in terms of their experience, how they've worked with other customers, especially large customers, federal, whatever. But maybe we're not going to look at their implementation of this technology. We're going to look at their approach and the probability of success of that approach, right? Which is a little bit different, and it is risky, but I think it's worth it in the end, because if not, you're not going to get the new and emerging technologies. That's not going to happen. So what are your thoughts on that, Clay? Just curious.
Yeah, I think for starters, the government is inherently risk averse. That's just the nature of how things tend to happen. And so due to a variety of factors and the number of acquisitions, it's easier for a procurement to be set up in a very risk-averse format. But not all procurements are successful like that. Some are, and some are not. And so being able to think outside the box a little bit and look at what is this procurement for? If it's for O&M of a mainframe system, no, you don't need to go beyond the government's walls to find that. In fact, you're going to have a hard time finding some of those examples outside of the government's walls. But if it's for a new technology, if it's artificial intelligence, if it's machine learning, if it's blockchain, you're going to have a hard time finding 3 or 5 past performance citations within the government that belong all to the same contractor that is bidding. And so you're going to be forced to consider outside of the government past performance. And there are various levels in between that will make that more or less viable. So I think it's about trying to find something that is going to give you a good chance of success without necessarily expecting that it guarantees success, because no past performance from any set of agencies or customers is going to guarantee success.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I also think that, when we talk about looking at new technologies like AI, machine learning, the other issue that you're going to grapple with is, even if a company has experience doing something in the federal government, they probably haven't finished the project. So you don't even know it's successful, right? All you know is, well, okay, they got it started really well, or, everybody seems to be happy with it, but you know how that goes. Honeymoon period's over, and then something goes wrong. Everybody freaks out, and, oh my God, bad contractor, bad product. So that's the other thing about it, that sometimes we're measuring or we're using these past performance evaluation on projects that haven't been completed. So even if you get that past performance, if it hasn't been completed, how do you know it's going to be successful? How do you know it will achieve that end objective, that you set out to achieve? I make a lot of noise over here. Anyway, so I always think about, how do we help the government be less risk averse, right? And look, I get it, having lived that world 41 years. I get why there's risk aversion, because the critics abound, right? Whether it's the Hill, GAO, IG, the press, somebody always has an opinion. But at some point, we got to teach people not to be scared of that opinion, because just because they have opinion doesn't make it right. And we all know what opinions are like. Go ahead. I'll put out there.
So Clay, I've got a question for you. There is real or perceived, what I sense in the marketplace is that new tech adoption tends lean towards the small, nimble business in people's heads. It's like, it's 3 guys in the basement or a couple of guys in the garage building something, and that the perception of the new entrant it lends itself to a conversation around small, nimble businesses. How do large businesses do tech adoption from a standpoint of, identifying things to invest in and then making those investments and then presenting them to the government, even when they have the brand recognition of a big name of a company? How do you all play? How does CGI play in the tech adoption space when the area, the environment could be crowded with the ideas of a couple of guys in the basement, or the people are going to build the next amazing thing?
Yeah, so I think like many of our competitors, CGI has a practice that's focused on those emerging technologies that allows us to do some of that research and development from within. And then we're always talking to customers and trying to understand what the business problems are that are out there, so that we can try to map those technologies to some of the business problems that the government has. So if there's an emerging problem that is out there and we can match that up to an emerging technology, we can build a prototype. And unlike some of the small businesses, we tend to have a little bit more funding at our disposal to work with to build some of those prototypes. The small businesses do some of that too, but they have to be quite judicious with making their selections as to where they're going to invest, because they're small, and so they might pick one particular prototype that they want to run with, whereas we're, and the other large businesses able to run multiple of those in parallel. But it's the same skill set, it's the same problem that needs to be addressed, and it's just a question of where do you focus that expertise in order to match it up to a probability of it being something that's interesting to the customer.
Right.
Awesome. I love that. Follow up. What about acquisitions and acquiring small companies? Do you all play that game? Or, I think small companies think it's like, if I can ever just only get on the radar with some great thing, that someone will come in and acquire my company. Do you actually play that game? Is that a strategy that you all use in either building the company, sustaining your level of growth, or going into emerging technology areas?
Yeah, definitely. So CGI is definitely an acquisitive company. We've made a few mergers in the federal space in the last few years. Beginning of this fiscal year, we merged with a company called Array. March of 2020, we merged with TerraThink, and about 6-7 months prior to that, we merged with Sunflower Systems. So those are 3 recent examples in the federal space, and there are lots of others across the globe where CGI has merged with companies large and small. In fact, as Soraya mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, I joined CGI through a merger with American Management Systems back in 2004. So like many people at CGI, I joined through a merger.
Awesome.
Oh,
Thank
wow.
you.
Excellent. Well, so I guess one of the things that I've always encouraged, and I hope people continue to do, is the RFI, the request for information, where the government hopefully comes out and says, look, I'm thinking about doing XYZ, and I'm looking at, who are the companies out there and what do they do? And then hopefully they're sharing section C, L, and M, so that it gives companies an opportunity to perhaps make some recommendations on how to look at past performance. I always say experience and past performance together. Experience, I think, is a little bit easier because that's just the narrative of what you've done, right? That's you giving, you, the vendor, given the opportunity to describe what you've done. The past performance is about references. Do you agree with that? I mean, are there opportunities there? How are you seeing those opportunities to make those recommendations? And I know it's hard for companies sometimes because they don't want to come off, a little too strong on the government. I think they need to come off a little strong, but anyway, but they don't always want to come off a little too strong with the government. But to be able to make recommendations on how we can consider past performance, and remembering that there could be new companies coming into the business, right? Companies that have never done business with the government. So just any thoughts that you might have on that?
Yeah, so definitely I agree that the RFIs are a great opportunity for companies to provide feedback to the government. At the same time, I'll say that we in industry don't always know what the government has in mind when an RFI is issued. Sometimes an RFI is issued and it's purely a question of, are there enough small businesses that qualify for this particular work that we should make it a small business set aside? And half of the responses are not being evaluated fully. They're just being evaluated to see, is this a small business response? Is this a large business response? And sometimes we don't receive any feedback when we submit a response to an RFI. And so, for all of the acquisition professionals out there in the government, I'd encourage you to provide, even if you can't provide individualized feedback, provide a status update and say, we received all these RFI responses. We decided we're not going to make a procurement, or we decided that we're going to do something in 2 years, or we're going to submit another RFI out to you in 6 months, because that's helpful information for industry. So we know what to plan around and where to make our investments. If we have an RFI that we respond to, sometimes we say, hey, this looks like a great opportunity for us, and we spin up some activity, and then we don't hear anything, and we struggle to get information, and we eventually let it go to the back burner. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, and sometimes it's the wrong thing to do. And as soon as it goes to the back burner, we get surprised with something.
That's true. That is true. Will, did you have?
Yeah, I do. I have one other question that I wanted to ask. As CGI, truly global company, okay, from a standpoint of seeing the world, seeing demand signals in government, probably also in commercial as well. What do you see of the global trends? Are you seeing anything in government that's like, this is very interesting? And then this follow-up question is, how are you positioning yourself for any trends that you see that are materializing in the space?
So let me start with kind of how we learn about the global trends. So we do a survey with customers around the globe every year. And as part of that, we ask our customers, what are they hearing about from a trend perspective? What are the things that are interesting to them from a technology perspective, from a market perspective? Are budgets likely to go up? Are they likely to go down? Are they likely to be flat? Is more money moving to capital or more money moving to OpEx? And so we use that as a way to inform ourselves on what the trends are. And then we'll share with our clients as well what we heard at a summarized level, so they can see how they compare to some of their peers across the globe, or how they compare to some of their peers within the federal government space, for example. In terms of some of the trends that we have seen recently, one that comes to mind is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity continues to be a bigger and bigger challenge, both for commercial entities, for government entities. It's one of those things that has increasing focus. And then, digital transformation, modernization, and there's some overlap there. Obviously, the more you modernize, the more legacy systems you can remove from your environment, probably the lower your cyber risk is.
Sure.
But in general, digital transformation is something that most entities are still somewhere along that journey. Some are just starting it. Some have achieved a lot. Everybody's on that journey somewhere.
Awesome. I love that. I love the idea of a survey. I had never, I see people do them, but I never thought about doing them in terms of doing a temperature check on the future. It's always like kind of survey of how well we've done in the past. But I really like that idea of doing the kind of imagining or asking people to imagine the future. So that's pretty cool. Thank you.
What about C-Script? Do you see anything in that area on the supply chain risk management side? I'm just curious.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the clients that we work with is CISA. And as you can imagine, that's an area of significant interest for CISA. So I hear about it from them from time to time, but we hear about it from many customers. After the SolarWinds attack, for example, that became a much more relevant item in many people's eyes. It opened people's eyes to what supply chain risk looks like. And then obviously with the ongoing war in Ukraine, there are different kinds of supply chain risk that are relevant right now, completely separate from the cyber angle, or even from a software angle.
Right.
Just where am I getting my supplies from, and are they available, is a secondary question to, are these supplies that I'm receiving trustworthy?
Right. Well, and I think that, probably folks now watching the news know a lot more about what supply chain really means, that it's not just the product and how the product is made, but even how the product is packaged, how the product is delivered, right? Packaged for delivery, delivered, and then how it's sold. You can go down the whole list. And a lot of people I don't think really understood that that's what supply chain really means. So thank you for that clarification. So the Will isn't cutting me off yet, so good. I get an opportunity to keep asking questions. Anyway, so I kind of want to go back a little bit to CPARs. So certainly CPARs is the system that the federal government is using, and it's fine. There have been efforts to improve that, and I know that there is still work ongoing in that area. But I guess I'm going to ask you this question. This is strictly your opinion as Clay and not necessarily representing CGI. If you were king for a day, because people say to me, "Sorry, if you were queen for a day." So if you were king for a day, what kind of system, what would you do to capture this great past performance data? Because there is value in this data that we have out there, but how do we make it usable and more effective for people?
That's a difficult question.
It is a toughie. I know, I did that on purpose. I wanted to stump the guest.
I don't think the CPAR system is the challenge. I think fundamentally, it's one of many jobs that a individual within the government has responsibility for, is updating CPARs. And it's just not at the top of the list for almost anybody. So if somebody has a really great experience or they have a really terrible experience, they're going to go out of their way to document that CPAR more often than not. But anything in between is not likely to get as much attention. Certain individuals are going to say, this is important to me, and I'm going to put the effort into it. But a lot of individuals are just not going to put that effort into it. So I guess the way I would turn that around a little bit is I would say that CPARs can be useful as a supplement to other information, but that there's no substitute for actually having a conversation. If you're trying to understand how a particular contractor did, you pick up the phone and you talk to that contracting officer, you talk to that program manager, you talk to that core, you can get a lot of insight into how that contractor did. And then tying that back to what we were talking about earlier, you can do the same thing with many non-federal customers to get information on how a particular contractor did in working with their client.
Yeah. So I will share with you that I partially agree. I agree with you that it's more people getting the data in than it is the system itself. But I do think the system asks too many questions, right? It goes to a level that it's just tedious. And I've long held, let's ask some basics. Did they do a good job? Did they have any problems? What were the problems? Did they overcome the problems? And would you give them another contract? Thank you very much. See you, goodbye. I don't need to know about their subcontractors, all that good stuff. If I want to know that, that's pick up the phone and go talk to somebody, right? If I want to get into that level of detail. So I do think that simplification would help, because then it would make it easier for people to get data into the system, right? Because you're right, the contracting officer, the program manager have 15,000 other tasks to do. This one's going to fall by the wayside unless they're really happy or unhappy. Usually if they're unhappy, that's the more popular thing to get in, right? When you're angry is when you go pound on the keys and get the information in there. So I certainly agree with that. But I continue to believe that we, the community at large, whether it's federal, industry, academia, we need to find a way to simplify CPAR so we can get the data in there and get it out of there as quickly and efficiently as possible, so that the CO has something as a starting point. And then you can't replace that phone call. And you're not going to do that for every procurement, but for a lot of the big ones, I think it is important to have that conversation. I have one last question on the industry side, because I do know industry is a little bit more hesitant to give past performance references. In other words, it's one thing if you know somebody, you can probably get the skinny, but for purposes of documenting it, for an evaluation, much harder. Companies do not like to give those references on one another for obvious reasons. Today, your competitors, tomorrow, you might be partners on a procurement. So just your thoughts on that. Anything you'd like to share?
That's definitely true. It is, it's standard practice within the government that other government agencies are going to reach out, or even potentially non-government agencies, commercial customers are going to reach out and ask for past performance. In the commercial world, that is not something that happens as frequently. And a lot of companies are hesitant to have their name out there. They don't want to be associated with the procurement in any way. And oftentimes they want to be secretive about who they're working with as well. They don't want their competitor to understand that they're working with company X, and that company X is helping them, because if company X then goes and helps their competitor, they lose some of that competitive advantage. The government is not often a competitor to those organizations.
Right.
So oftentimes the concern is more about their name getting out there through Freedom of Information Act requests, for example. And so I would advise that if you're looking to get information from a company, you consider how to make that process as discreet as possible. Right. So, for example, is it possible to have the company provide a description of the work, the contractor that's bidding, provide a description of the work that occurred, but then not provide the name, the email address, the phone number for the individual as a part of the proposal? Instead, have that be under separate cover, have that be marked separately, and then let the contracting officer or somebody else in the procurement organization place a call to a phone number and say, hey, I was given your phone number. I don't know who you are, but I was given your phone number as a part of this proposal that was submitted, and I'd like to get your feedback on company X. Right. And as a part of that, they could have a conversation. They could disclose who they are verbally and describe the work that was done. The government can get the same kind of input without the company fearing that company X's proposal is going to then work to their disadvantage in some way.
Right. Very good. Yeah. All right, Mr.
All right, Soraya, we're at that time.
See, told you.
It's at that time. So it's golden nugget time. Clay, this has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your contributions. Give me some things to think about. So I'm going to go first. My golden nugget. My golden nugget I'm going to focus my golden nugget to our contracting community, and that golden nugget is going to kind of lay on top of my earlier question. Be willing to be convinced. Don't come to the party with a preconceived notion of what past performance, what experience looks like. Be willing, be open to being convinced of what that could be, what's in the art of the possible. So that's my nugget to our community, is that we know we are trained, and it is reinforced that past performance and experience looks a certain way. I think we're just in an environment now, especially with new entrants and new technology, emerging technology. We must open our aperture a bit and be willing to be convinced what past performance and experience looks like in its current form. So that's my nugget. Soraya.
Oh, you want me to get my nugget? I was going to let Clay go next, so I don't steal any of his nuggets.
Okay, that's fair.
All right, Clay, you go, because I don't want to steal your nuggets. I had a feeling you and I might be sharing a couple of nuggets.
I'm not sure I have any nuggets, but I'll do my best to offer something up. My recommendation would be to look at each particular situation independently and try to figure out what makes sense for that particular situation, as well as to kind of look at the default differently. I think right now the default in the procurement world is usually we want 3 past performance citations within X number of years of the date of this procurement, and they all need to be federal. In fact, oftentimes they need to be working with a client that's more similar to this particular portion of the government. And sometimes that makes sense if you've got a particular requirement. Oftentimes that's not necessary. And so I would encourage folks to think about why do I need to restrict this particular procurement to this type of federal agency? Why do I need to restrict the past performance to the federal government as a whole? Is it okay if I got something from a state, from a local organization, from a commercial entity, from a non-US government entity? Are those going to be equally viable? And can I get a mix in order to leverage that federal past performance that I know I need. They need to know how to work in the federal government. They need to know how a PIV card works, how a background investigation works, while at the same time understanding that there may be capabilities out there that can be leveraged that weren't leveraged in the federal government as frequently.
That's fantastic, and I'm glad I let you go before me because I was thinking along those lines. I would have never been as articulate as you were. So Will knows that I never follow instructions. So I have a couple of nuggets. You know that.
Here we go.
Here we go. Here we go. So first, to government. Two things that I would say. One, try something new. Don't be afraid to try something different. Yes, it feels uncomfortable, but if you do the right things for the right reasons, you're probably not going to get yourself in trouble. And that goes along the lines with kind of what Clay was just saying, that you have to think of your strategy in terms of what you're buying. What is that past performance? The questions that I ask when I'm trying to hire a contracting officer are very different than the questions that I ask when I'm trying to hire a program manager or when I'm trying to hire an accountant. And it's very different when I'm trying to hire somebody at an entry level versus somebody who I'm bringing in to be middle management or to be a senior leader. So similarly, we need to think of past performance when we talk about on our contracts in the same way. What is that right past performance mix that I'm looking for that assures me that I'm getting the right company to do the work that I need? So that would be, and I tie that to try something new. Don't just do what you've always done, right? So that's number one. That's for the government side. And I just going to add that little nugget. It's like a sub nugget because I want to emphasize something I said earlier.
You see, Clay, what I have to deal with, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Every day.
Yeah, she never gives up. And that is issue an RFI with a purpose. Tell industry what its purpose is. If it's to find out about small business, then tell them it's about small business. If you want to get their opinion on something, tell them that that's what you want. Ask questions, but don't just toss out an RFI and leave industry kind of twisting in the wind trying to figure out what the heck you want. Because if you pinpoint them, they're going to give you the data and then give the feedback. I agree with that, especially status. And then for industry, my nugget is don't be afraid to encourage the government to try something new. So don't be afraid to go out with that crazy idea that says, maybe you might want to consider doing this, or maybe you want to try that. You guys do this to each other all the time. Companies buy from each other and they work with one another and they contract with one another. And sometimes you're looking at things with a different lens, and maybe we need to see that lens. Maybe we need to try to exercise that lens. So I always encourage industry to give us feedback, to tell us, the government, when we're out here doing these solicitations and contracts, especially when that opportunity is given through the RFI or draft RFP, don't be afraid to say, hey, here's a new approach. Here's something you might want to try. Here's something you might want to consider. Here's how we've seen this done before, or here's how we do it to ourselves here in industry. But I do think that industry should try. So those are my two nuggets. Don't be afraid to try something new on the government side. Industry, don't be afraid to tell us to try something new. And the sub nugget is RFIs with a purpose. RFIs with a purpose.
now that we've gotten through sub nuggets, Clay, look, we love to just give you an opportunity. If anybody wanted to get in contact with you, how would they get in contact with you?
Thanks, Will. So easiest way to get in contact with me is by email. My email address is clay.goldwein, GOLDWEIN @cgifederal.com. All
right. And with that, what an amazing experience. Thank you so very much, Clay. As always, Soraya, it's been fun and informative. The combo platter, we just can't get enough of it. So thank you so very much.
I told you, we only have the best coming to join us to have the conversation. Clay, I can't thank you enough for joining us, for sharing your insights and your experience. And thank you for what you do. I mean, I'm very familiar with CGI's work through the many years. I was introduced to what was then AMS back in the 90s in my days at INS and a couple other agencies. So I'm very familiar with the work that you guys do, the products that you deliver. And I thank you. I thank you for the partnership with the government. And most of all, I thank you for the partnership with me and now with Will and all the work that you've done through ACT-IAC, CGI, and a couple of other organizations. Keep doing what you're doing. We're going to get it right out here.
Absolutely. Thanks for all that you do.
I really appreciate the partnership as well, Soraya, from when you were at DHS to more recently after you've left the government. And Will and Sarai, I really appreciate you having me on today.
All right.
Well, thank
And
you,
with that,
Ted.
all the best. Be well.
All right, well.